In 1918, as the modern world believed it was finally turning a page, from trenches to peace, from ration lines to victory parades, from telegrams of loss to headlines that dared to print the word tomorrow, millions of people went to bed thinking history was about to slow down, and then woke up to a new kind of war inside their own bodies. A fever that climbed like a fire up a staircase, joints that ached as if hammered from the inside, a throat that burned, a cough that tasted wet and metallic, and a fatigue so heavy it felt less like sickness than like gravity changing. By noon, the heat in your skull could make time blur. By evening, your skin might take on a strange, dusky hue, bruised, purplish, sometimes drifting toward blue, as if the blood itself had forgotten how to carry air. And in the worst cases, the decline could be terrifyingly fast, the chest tightening, the lungs filling, the face turning that haunting colour that signals oxygen slipping away, while a doctor, exhausted, under-equipped, and painfully honest, could offer little beyond bed rest, fluids if you could keep them down, and the quiet knowledge that medicine had no silver bullet for what was unfolding. Outside your window, the sounds of the city changed. Church bells rang not for weddings, but for the unending arithmetic of funerals. Hospital corridors overflowed. Nurses worked until they dropped. Coffins and gravediggers became scarce, and entire households could vanish from records in days, not because they moved, but because they died. And the strangest part was how modern it all felt, because this catastrophe didn't arrive on medieval carts. It travelled on the machinery of progress. Railways that turned nations into corridors, steamships that stitched oceans into schedules, factories and barracks that packed human beings into dense shared air, and a wartime world so busy moving bodies and supplies that it also moved microbes with ruthless efficiency. What we call the Spanish flu was not merely a harsh winter illness, but a planetary shock that struck at the exact moment humanity was congratulating itself for becoming unstoppable. And it did so in waves, surges that rose, receded, and returned. So that just as families, workplaces, and governments tried to stand back up, the water came in again. Its death toll is still argued over, but its scale is not. Tens of millions died worldwide, more than the combat deaths of World War I, and the pandemic's cruelty wasn't limited to the very young or very old, because it also carved through people in their 20s and 30s with a brutality that shocked communities into disbelief. Influenza is an old enemy, yet 1918 was different, because the virus circulating that year appears to have evolved into an unusually lethal form. And while historians still debate the exact geographic spark, whether early outbreaks were first amplified in one region or another, the narrative mechanism is clear. Influenza viruses change quickly, they mutate and adapt, and sometimes they discover a terrible trick, spreading efficiently while provoking an immune response so intense it harms the host, turning the body's defenses into a weapon against itself. In the era before antivirals, before modern intensive care, and before antibiotics that could reliably treat secondary bacterial pneumonia, doctors were often fighting a ghost with bandages, guesses, and grit. And the difference between a bad flu and a fatal cascade could be a matter of days as weakened lungs became vulnerable to bacterial invasion. Every global disaster has a pivot, the moment when the story stops being local. And for 1918, that pivot wasn't a single cinematic explosion, but a chain of crowded rooms and moving vehicles. Military camps where bunks were stacked like shelves, transports where coughing echoed in closed air, mess halls where fatigue and dust and stress primed bodies for infection, and medical stations already stretched thin by war. Because war did not merely move armies, it moved microbes, sending people across borders faster than public health could track, and amplifying outbreaks wherever bodies were concentrated. In the spring of 1918, many places saw an early wave that often looked comparatively mild, which became part of the trap. People got sick, recovered, and assumed the danger had passed. So the gears of society kept turning, production continued, troop movements went on, celebrations resumed, and the virus quietly learned the roots of the modern world. Then, later in 1918, the second wave arrived like a tonal shift in the film of history. Harder, faster, deadlier. Patients who had seemed fine could deteriorate rapidly, lungs failing, oxygen dropping, faces and fingers tinting blue, and hospitals filling beyond capacity, so that beds spilled into hallways, nurses reused masks. Families attempted home care and discovered that home could become a quarantine with no exit. Mass gatherings, parades, rallies, packed streetcars, theatres, became multipliers not because people were foolish, but because they were human, and because influenza spreads before its victims feel fully sick, meaning the virus could outrun official reaction, so that by the time authorities considered closing venues or limiting crowds, transmission had already leapt onward. The pattern repeated. Surge, lull, return. Like an ocean that does not care whether you're ready, until exhaustion became a public mood, the kind that makes people desperate for normalcy, even while danger remains. A city, after all, is an organism. It breathes through factories, eats through markets, thinks through offices, and heals through hospitals. And in 1918, the virus attacked not only individuals, but the city's ability to function. Because when a large fraction of workers fall ill simultaneously, the basics fail. Garbage collection slows, food distribution stutters, police and firefighters thin out, schools close, then churches, then theatres, and street life becomes a strange theatre of masks, fear, and arguments over what safety even means. Some places introduced anti-spitting ordinances, some banned public gatherings, some staggered business hours. Some tried layered interventions early, while others delayed, worried about wartime production, morale, or victory celebrations. And those delays cost lives, because exponential spread punishes hesitation. In hospitals, triage became brutally literal. Who gets a bed? Who gets a blanket? Who gets a nurse's minute of attention? And when everyone is sick, care becomes scarce. So mothers struggle to nurse, friends cannot visit, funerals shrink or disappear, and grief becomes private not by choice, but by infection. And when people cannot explain a disaster, they fill the gap with whatever stories are available. So the medical uncertainty of 1918, conflicting theories, inconsistent guidance, improvised treatments, and the lack of tools to see viruses clearly, collided with a wartime information crisis. Because censorship and propaganda blurred reality, and neutral newspapers that reported more openly helped create the misleading nickname Spanish flu, as if the disease belonged to one nation rather than to the network itself. In that vacuum, symbols hardened. Masks became not just fabric, but identity. Signals of caution, virtue, compliance, defiance. Restrictions became political. Cooperation competed with resistance, and fear looked for targets, sometimes turning suspicion toward outsiders, immigrants, or anyone who could be blamed for an invisible enemy, revealing the moral fracture line pandemics exploit. As fear rises, empathy shrinks. And when empathy shrinks, societies can turn on themselves. Eventually, the waves softened, not because humanity won in a clean, heroic finale, but because epidemics burn through available pathways as immunity accumulates, behaviours shift, and the virus's advantage narrows. So that by 1919 and into 1920, many places saw the worst recede, leaving behind a world that felt older than the calendar admitted. Public health became a permanent concern rather than a temporary emergency. Cities learned, sometimes too late, that closing spaces early could save lives, and families carried stories of sudden blue-faced deaths, of siblings lost within days, of hospitals that sounded like battlefields, while entire societies absorbed a quiet lesson that modernity is not invincibility. Yet in a twist almost as haunting as the pandemic itself, collective memory often moved on quickly, because the war had a narrative, heroes, victories, borders redrawn, while the flu had only absence, empty chairs, missing names, and an era that learned to speak about moving forward because there were too many funerals to fully process, and that may be the most unsettling legacy. A catastrophe so vast it became hard to describe, so common it became almost invisible, so modern it still feels familiar. Because if you listen closely, you can still hear the pattern echoing into the present. The confident world, the hidden pathogen, the crowded network, the delayed response, the second wave, the overload, the arguments, the blame, the fatigue, and finally, the quiet reckoning. And once you recognize that pattern, you start to understand that history isn't just the past, it's a warning system. I'm Leo, and this is the story of how a virus exploited the machinery of progress. And if you want more histories where the past explains the present, follow along, and I'll see you in the next era.